Hey, everybody, welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by a guest I've been so thrilled to have on this podcast. I'm joined by David Closson today. He serves as the director of the Center of Biblical Worldview at the Family Research Council. He researches, writes, speaks. I don't know how he does all the stuff that he does. He serves as a fellow for human dignity and public policy at the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he's about to complete his PhD. He is a friend of mine. I've heard him teach many times, always look forward to it, and one of our most valuable voices in the pro-life movement. And we're going to be talking about his new book, Life After Roe, Equipping Christians in the Fight for Life Today. David, thanks so much for coming on the So We Speak podcast.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Joy to be with you, brother.
You know, I remember about a year ago probably talking about your work on this book, and from that moment I was like, man, I cannot wait for this book to come out. Whenever it was able to pre-order, I pre-ordered it. And the crazy thing is just looking back, having read the book now, looking back, so much has happened even since we talked about it. I mean, we're several years out now from the Dobbs decision, but in the lead up to that and the aftermath, the landscape has really changed. And that's one of the reasons this book is so important. Um, Before we get into the specific things about the book, I thought you can see your passion for this topic in the book. It's not, you're not writing it just as a journalist. You're writing it as somebody who really cares about this, who's done a lot of good work here. So I thought I'd just kick off by asking, when did you feel the pull towards the pro-life movement? How'd you start to get involved in this? Give us some of the background on that.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Cole. And I actually honestly don't remember a moment where I wasn't convictionally pro-life, and I attribute that to my parents. I remember growing up, the church we attended for several years actually met. It actually met in a Seventh Day Adventist church. So they'd have their service on Saturday. We could be in there on Sunday, and it was right next to an abortion clinic. And so I remember often going to church or even driving by the church and seeing that abortion clinic, seeing people praying outside of it. Of course, when I went to seminary at Southern Seminary, I remember I was there when several of those undercover videos came out in 2015, 2016. Uh, Went out to the clinic and prayed. Had friends who would counsel young women who were thinking and considering about abortion. My church was very involved. And so, yeah, to answer the question, Cole, I can't remember a moment when I wasn't um, passionately moved kind of I think just as a little kid, I had a sense of justice. And this is a vulnerable population. The unborn can't really do anything to defend themselves. And for those of us who can use our voice, we should do that to draw attention for our vulnerable preborn neighbors.
Hmm. Yeah, most vulnerable group of the population for sure. So the book Life After Roe is obviously about the overturning of the Roe v. Wade decision, right around 50 years. In the Dobbs decision, you've got the Supreme Court, who over the last few years has gotten more textualist, conservative judges. And everybody kind of knew the time was right for this. It was in some ways like the holy grail of constitutional law. And then it happened. And even for those of us that expected it to happen, it still was kind of a surprise that it actually did. And you can think of the moments that lead up to it. You can remember where you were. I love the way you covered this in the book. Where were you when the decision came out, and what was the aftermath like?
Yeah, so Cole, the book begins in my preface actually, not the day that the opinion was handed down on June 24th, but actually, if you'll recall, 6 weeks prior was when the Alito decision was leaked, and so Politico, and even to this day, we still don't know. Different people have theories, but how that opinion was leaked to the press, and I was only a few blocks away, honestly, from the Supreme Court when all of a sudden my phone started buzzing. A lot of people from around the country. Have you seen the Politico article? Have you seen the political article? And I remember opening the article, and it had been published maybe 15 minutes earlier. And I just kind of started scanning it. And then there was the excerpt from the Alito decision that said Roe was always wrong, that it was going to be overturned, and that the power to make decisions about abortion would return to the people and their elected representatives. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if it was real. It seemed legitimate. And so I remember going to the Supreme Court It was probably 9 o'clock in the evening. I remember I was probably maybe the 50th person there. And again, I described the scene in the preface of the book, but it was mostly young women who were there initially, kind of consoling one another. I saw people lighting candles. But it didn't take long for the crowds to show up, the angry crowds to show up. You saw security guards coming out of the court, erecting barricades. The Capitol Hill police blocked off First Street, which is the street that uh, intersects right there where the U.S. Capitol, Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court is. And I stayed there for about 3 hours. By the time I left, thousands of people were there. And you know what was interesting, Cole? One of the scriptures that has really become precious to me since I moved to DC was Romans 11, where it talks about, the Lord always has a remnant.
Mhm.
And again, it was interesting that night. I felt like I was all alone. I'm probably the only one that's excited about this potential decision. And I began looking around and noticed, okay, there's some people from my church. There's some people from another pro life organization. And again, this is late into the night. About 12 of us gathered arms, began to pray, and we prayed, Lord, if this decision is real, that you give the justices the courage of their convictions, that you'd protect them, you'd protect their families. Little did we know there'd be an assassination attempt a couple of weeks from that point on Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh. But that night is for sure seared in my memory. And of course, we'd find out 6 weeks later that that was legitimate, that it was the court's majority opinion authored by Justice Samuel Alito. And we've been living in the aftermath of that ever since.
I just think of all the moments leading up to that. I mean, I can remember exactly where I was for each of the appointments of the justices that President Trump appointed and thinking, wow, this really is going to shape the future. This is really going to change things. I mean, um, learning that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died, that Scalia had died. I mean, there's just so many moments leading up to it. And then you get the decision. I think you give a great overview in the book as to how the law of the pro abortion and the pro life movement has been shaped in the last 100 years. So you have states, you have the Roe decision, you have Casey, you have Dobbs, and how that shapes everything. I think something that gets lost in there though is the inner mechanics of the Dobbs decision. What did Alito actually argue? What did his opinion actually do? There was a lot of talk afterwards, some of it accurate, some of it not. But it's really important to understand what the Dobbs decision actually did. What did it accomplish, and what did it not, honestly? So give us kind of the high level view. What did the Alito decision argue? What's the implication? And then a little bit, what did the dissent argue? I mean, it wasn't as much argument as declaration in the dissent, I think. But give us kind of the lay of the land there.
Yeah, just to put it kind of succinctly, Cole, the Alito decision, like you said, has been mischaracterized. And so I think there are even many people on the pro life side who will say, well, the Dobbs decision returned the issue to the states. Even President Trump in the 2024 campaign has often taken credit for the Dobbs decision. And I think he rightfully can
Hmm.
take credit for much of the Dobbs decision. It's three of his justices, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh, who were in that majority alongside Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, who decided to not just uphold Mississippi's 15-week bill, because the presenting situation for the court, Cole, was the constitutionality of a 15-week protection law that kind of challenged Roe's assertion that that states can't protect life in the first trimester. And so, yes, again, President Trump can take much credit for appointing the justices that were in the majority. But on the campaign, he often made this comment that it returned the issue to the states. And that's true to a point. And so, what Justice Alito actually says, he says, now the power to make a decisions about abortion is returned to the people and their elected representatives. That's the key phrase, the
Hmm.
people and their elected representatives. He didn't use the word states. What does this mean? Well, it means that, yes, in our states, our state legislatures previously passed pro life laws that had not been allowed to be enforced could be enforced. And we saw in the months after Roe v. Wade was overturned, many states, and I document this process in my book, whether it's South Carolina or Iowa or North Carolina, Florida, some of these states had laws that they had passed that were not allowed to go into effect that were allowed to go into effect. Other states immediately passed pro-life laws. So yes, states have tremendous power, but this is still there's still a role for the federal government. For example, think of the Hyde Amendment. That's a legislative provision that's attached to appropriation bills every year that says our taxpayer dollars can't fund abortion or abortion related services through the federal level. At the federal level, we still have other pro life riders. President Trump, since becoming president, he's used the power of the executive branch to reinstate the Mexico City policy, to rejoin the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is a group of nations coming together. He spearheaded this in his first administration to say there's no right internationally for abortion. And so I think that's why it's important. The federal government still has a significant role to play. Earlier this year, tragically, there was legislation that was considered called the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. This is legislation that simply says if a baby survives a botched abortion, it's entitled to medical care. I believe there was no Democrats who supported that legislation in the Senate, and maybe just one or two that supported it in the House of Representatives, and so it failed. It didn't advance because it didn't have the 60 votes in the Senate. And so there's what the Dobbs decision essentially does. It allows all of us at all levels to advocate for life. In the dissent, which would have been Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, they pretty much, like you said, just asserted very strongly that they thought this was flawed. They thought the Roe v. Wade decision was deeply rooted in our nation's history and a proper reading of the Constitution. And I think what was marvelous is if you look back at Alito's majority opinion, he has a whole section where he responds to the dissent.
Mhm.
And he goes out of his way to say that this idea that abortion rights was a part of our nation's heritage and history does not pass even the basic historical overview. And he shows, and he includes this, by the way, there's an appendix in the majority opinion that shows the pro-life laws that every single state, including territory, like think Arizona and New Mexico before they even became states, every state had passed a pro-life law. And it was only really until the 60s that some states, right before Roe was first issued, 1973, that some states began to loosen their pro-life laws. So again, it's a masterclass in history as far as Alito's opinion goes.
Yeah, I remember reading that and just thinking you could have asked for a better opinion on this. And I think some of that I'd love to get your thought on, the inside baseball of that. You mentioned in the book that Chief Justice Roberts did not agree that Dobbs should overturn Roe and Casey, but instead would be a more moderate position. Of course, he could have sided in the dissent, but then Clarence Thomas would have gotten to write the opinion since he's the longest tenured justice. And of course, in his, he talks about undoing substantive due process. I mean, there's a lot going on there. And Alito's opinion is just so balanced and thoughtful and circumspect. It's really masterful. I even think for somebody who's not in any way a legal expert like me, you read it and you think this is a great summary of how the law works, how the history of abortion in our country has played out. It's something I think everybody should read. And I think to grasp what you're saying, to really understand the implications. Yes, it meant the state laws that couldn't be enforced now can be, but leaves the door open for federal legislation going through
Yes.
Congress. It seems to me like the Democrats kind of understood the implications of that first. I think conservatives mostly thought, okay, great, grassroots level, let's get the states to pass these laws. But before you know it, the surge on the federal level is coming to replace Roe with legislation, not do it by the courts, which has kind of been the conservative argument. Why was this done by the courts in the first place? But
Right.
now we're going to pass a law. Thank goodness that didn't gain momentum, but neither did a lot of the pro-life movement. The aftermath was actually a gridlock, like maybe I didn't expect. Maybe you did expect it. What in the aftermath? There were some surprising things in the midterms. What surprised you? What kind of confirmed what you had thought after Roe was overturned? And what does that say about the landscape today in the pro-life movement?
Yeah, so let's remember the Dobbs decision is handed down June 24th, 2022. This is right in the middle of Joe Biden's first midterm election. And so, of course, in a midterm election, you have a third of the Senate up, you have the entire House of Representatives up, you have a lot of key governorships. And what was interesting, Cole, is abortion all of a sudden was the main issue. And in many states, you had more liberal organizations, you had the Democrat Party make this their number one campaign issue to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And this was repeated actually again in the 2024 general election as well. Kansas was the first state actually to have an abortion related amendment, a statewide referendum, I should say. And the pro abortion side prevailed there. And what's interesting is in the midterm elections, you also had several states have referendums. Since you and I are having this conversation now in May of 2025, there have been 17 states that have had statewide votes on abortion. And the pro abortion side has prevailed in 14 out of those 17 states, including in very red states, very conservative states. I think Kentucky, I think Montana. And I think this gets to a really important issue here. We don't want to get too academic here, but what this shows us, and even so, the 2024 election, I think Donald Trump winning in all the battleground states, and yet many of those states that voted for Donald Trump, they still voted to codify abortion or to expand abortion access. This, I have a mentor, Andrew Walker, professor at Southern Seminary. I once heard him say, our law is inherently pedagogical. Our law is a teacher, it's a tutor, as different folks have said throughout the years. And we need to realize for 49 years, now 2 to 3 generations of Americans have been told abortion is permissible. Abortion is morally praiseworthy. Abortion is just as a fail-safe, a form of birth control if you need it. And when all of a sudden it feels that that's been pulled out from under you, uh, there's an opportunity to kind of exploit people. And the abortion industry, they took advantage of this moment uh, and hundreds of millions of dollars was at their disposal to spread outright lies about a lot of these referendums. But it also speaks to the case that, again, our country, I would argue, is a little bit more pro abortion, pro choice than maybe some of us would have admitted prior to the overturning of Roe. But let me say something encouraging. It took 49 years to get to the point where we could overturn Roe v. Wade. We're kidding ourselves if we think it'll just take a couple of months or years to kind of undo that morally corrosive effect of 49 years of Roe being in place.
That's a really good point, and a lot of the data you share in the book actually bears that out. Is people just are a lot more pro-abortion than we think, or at least uncomfortable with really extensive pro-life legislation. There's kind of a happy medium in the polling and in a lot of these laws where the American public sits, and that causes some issues for pro-lifers, especially which we'll come back to this in a little bit, but especially certain approaches in the pro-life movement that causes some problems. But you point out rightly so, it was taken for granted in the last couple of generations, and it's going to take a while to change that. I want to talk about some of the ways that you alluded to that the pro-abortion lobby responded to the Dobbs decision. They certainly went on the offensive, and they certainly outflanked, I think, some of the pro-lifers who were still celebrating the Supreme Court decision. It does, I think it turned out that a lot of Christians have been better discipled by the culture than they have the Bible on this topic. And I want to get to some Christian approaches, what does the Bible say? But before we do, let me give you a few lines that probably all of us have heard about abortion legislation and just kind of let you respond. And I say that knowing that many Christians hear this, they might think that that's not quite right, but maybe don't know how to respond, especially when it comes at a really personal level. So I think the one we hear the most is without abortion, women cannot get adequate health care. If we defund Planned Parenthood, I don't know what that crazy statistic was that floated around for a while that only 1% of what they do is abortion. What about the rest of the healthcare? So, that's one of the things you hear. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that pregnancy resource centers actually outnumber abortion clinics 3 to 1. And any woman who finds herself in an unplanned pregnancy or crisis pregnancy, uh, there is care available. And actually, I have a copy of my book in front of me, and on page 313, I have a pretty significant content footnote that I think is important to know some of these numbers. Let me just briefly point out pregnancy resource centers. Again, there are 2,750 of them. In 2023, they provided $358 million in material goods and services, over 16 million clients that they engaged. In terms of, again, actual numbers, those pregnancy resource centers provided 703,000 pregnancy tests, performed 517,000 ultrasounds for free, provided 19,000 clients with after abortion support. It goes on. In terms of actual tangible goods and services, they provided 3.5 million packs of diapers valued at $40 million, 1.2 million packs of wipes valued at 3.6 million, 4.2 million baby clothes outfits valued at 21 million, and 300,000 containers of baby formula, which would be valued at 6 million. Now, Cole, as a father of a 5-month-old myself now, I know that, having a baby costs some money,
Hmm.
and appreciate that more now than I did 5 months ago. But it is true that these pregnancy resource centers, again, are on the front lines. And so this idea that a woman who is facing an unplanned pregnancy is going to be alone, is not going to have care she needs, is frankly not true. And praise God that it's not true, because the church, in large part, has stepped up to the plate. And these pregnancy resources centers are in pretty much every community across this country, outnumbering abortion clinics, like I said, 3 to 1.
Hmm. Yeah, I've always thought, and I appreciate the approach in this book, that if we are going to take on the pro-abortion movement, we also need to be pro women and family and care, pro prenatal care, to the extent that these kinds of arguments are laughably false. We need to do such a good job of providing this, which, as you pointed out, is getting to be the case, that this argument doesn't even make sense. But it is one that you hear a lot. If we get rid of this, what about kind of the collateral damage to prenatal care? Another one, you hear this in different forms. I mean, I guess this is under the big umbrella of kind of the her body, her choice. The doctor's office isn't big enough for a woman, her doctor, and the federal government. I think this one is kind of underhanded, but you do hear it a lot. I mean, should the government be involved in making that decision? Should it not? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think, and that's a line I remember Raphael Warnock used in the campaign for that Georgia Senate seat. I think he had a quip where he, tried to say it all kind of cute. At the end of the day, we're again talking about basic human rights, and I would affirm that a man, or a woman has rights over their own body. I believe in bodily autonomy, bodily integrity. We talked about this during the COVID-19 pandemic and forced vaccine mandates. But fundamentally, when it comes to an unborn child, you're dealing with two bodies here. You're dealing with two persons. You're dealing with two people made in God's image that have value and dignity. And again, this I could almost imagine, 1850s America. Well, if you don't like slavery, you don't have a slave. Well,
Hmm.
again, this is a basic human rights issue, and this is something that concerns all of us. This is why men should be, especially Christian men, need to be weighing in on this. Uh, Women, families. This is a basic humans right issue.
Hmm. One of the other common ones is just an argument from statistics. If we do away with abortion, it's not what we're going to be doing away with is not just people who willy-nilly want to get an abortion. They don't want the responsibility. It's rape, it's incest, it's medical threats to the life of the mother. Those are the things that are included as exceptions in much of the legislation anyways. That's the substantive piece of abortion. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, we need to realize that 92% of elective abortions are done because of convenience. And don't take my word for it. Actually, take the abortion industry's word for it. So, the Guttmacher Institute, that is the most significant pro abortion think tank in America, in their statistics, they say that only 7% of women report that their abortion was because of health complications for the mother or the baby. And according to the Guttmacher Institute, only 0.5% of abortions are sought because of rape. Again,
Mm-hmm.
that's Guttmacher Institute. That's their number, only 0.5. So again, it's the overwhelming majority of percentages of abortion are simply for matters of convenience.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of staggering when you think about the scale of that. I mean, you say vast majority, 92%, but then you realize over 50 years, we're talking 60 million
Yeah,
abortions. I mean,
yeah.
so we're talking a huge, huge number of human lives. And that's where you kind of with clear eyes look at those statistics. It's almost overwhelming to think about it. On the Christian side of things, one of the really helpful pieces, there's really two big chapters in the book that are helpful in terms of looking at what the Bible says and looking at what Christian history would show us in the pro-life movement. There's a lot of confusion today among Christians, which is uncharacteristic in history. Christians have been pretty monolithic in history on this topic. Um, what do you attribute this confusion to? And what are some of the lines of thought that you include here to equip Christians to think more clearly about the abortion issue?
Yeah, Cole, let me share very briefly just some statistics. So, in June of 2023, so 1 year after Roe was overturned, I had an opportunity to work with George Barna, the well-known pollster and researcher.
Hmm.
We wanted to find out, what do regular churchgoers believe about this issue. And because you call, especially whenever there's an election season, pollsters, whether it's Gallup or Pew, they want to all tell us what Christians believe. And what's interesting though is most of those surveys are just done by self-identification. So if someone
Hmm.
came to you, Cole, and asked you a bunch of questions into the survey and said, "Oh, by the way, are you a Christian?" If you said yes, you might not have been to church since your mom dropped you off at Vacation Bible School in 1998, and yet you're marked down as a Christian. So that's fundamentally
Hmm.
unhelpful. So we actually only interviewed those who regularly go to church. And this is 1 year after Roe was overturned. And what we found gets to what you were just getting at, as far as that we are not as monolithic as we think. So just very, very quickly, 65% of churchgoers we found out identify as pro-life. Or excuse me, that was 63%. 63% identify as pro-life. 22% identify as pro-choice. 10% said they could go one way or the other, and then 5% said they really honestly didn't know where they stood. So that was really interesting. The fact that I don't think in the church we're as monolithic as maybe we think, or as monolithic as the media thinks we are.
Hmm.
Two other stats. One, we found out that 65% of churchgoers believe the Bible identifies a point when life begins. 21% said no, the Bible does not identify a point when life begins. 13% said they didn't know. And I'm glad we had the foresight to ask a follow-up question. So for those 65% that said yes, the Bible identifies a point when life begins, we asked the question, at what point? And 52% of those folks said conception, but 8% said life begins when the baby has been delivered and begins breathing. Another 7% said the Bible teaches that viability is when life begins. Another 6% said the Bible teaches that life begins around 6 weeks after fertilization, when a heartbeat can be detected. Which I would just want to go to those people. I've read the Bible cover to cover. Where is that level of specificity? Please show me that verse.
Right. Yeah.
And it was another 12% then that backed off and said they had initially said, yes, the Bible draws a line. And then when we asked where the line is, they backed off.
Hmm.
So again, some confusion there. And then the final stat I'll give you is we found out that only 44% of churchgoers told us that they had heard a sermon or teaching on abortion in the previous 12 months. Now, let me remind you, we're doing this survey in June of 23, meaning this is the last 12 months is when after Roe had been overturned. Now, Cole, if you remember, in the months after Roe v. Wade, everybody and their mother-in-law had an opinion about abortion and wanted to share it. The NBA is putting out a statement. The NFL is putting out a statement. I'm sure the Homeowners Association of Albuquerque probably put out a statement. So everyone has an opinion and they want to share it, except it would appear many pastors. And
Hmm.
again, I'm not someone who wants to beat up on pastors, but it appears that there was at least some reluctance to speak about it. Which one more stat, the thing that we did find encouraging is that 71% of these churchgoers told us they actually wanted their pastor to provide additional worldview teaching on abortion. So again, it's almost 3 out of 4 told us, you know what? We actually want our pastor to weigh in on this and help kind of form our moral imagination and conscience on this issue. So, room for encouragement for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I was surprised and encouraged by that people want their pastor to speak to important issues, especially like you said, within the year afterwards. It's not random at that point. It's really what people are talking about and thinking about, and the church needs to, in the right setting and in the right way, we need to address this and help people think through it in a biblical way. Speaking of the biblical way, if you had 5 minutes, or you had an elevator pitch or something to talk about the Bible's position on this topic, the stats bear out that a lot of people couldn't make the case one way or the other. How would you make the case for what the Bible says about life?
Yeah, Cole, I'm convinced, of course, that the Bible is pro life from cover to cover. Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, unbelievable poetic language that makes that clear. If I had one text, though, I would encourage folks to look at Luke chapter 1, verses 39 through 45. This is right after Mary has been visited by the angel. She's told she's going to be with child. Of course, she's a young girl. She's freaking out. She immediately, the text says, with haste, goes to her relative Elizabeth. And three details about this exchange that Elizabeth and Mary have, I think, makes this really, in my view, one of the most profound pro-life texts in Scripture. Number one, we find out that the unborn John the Baptist leaps for joy upon hearing Mary's voice. So again, just remarkable that Scripture tells us that John the Baptist is feeling joy. I think that's remarkable, especially when you consider who is John the Baptist. Well, Isaiah predicted 700 years earlier that there would be a forerunner of the Messiah. I think you can make the case that John the Baptist is fulfilling his purpose in life as the forerunner of the Messiah well in utero. I
Hmm.
think that's remarkable. I would also say, number two, Elizabeth refers to Mary as a mother. She says, "Why is the mother of my Lord coming to visit me?" At a time when most women would have no idea that they were pregnant, maybe even prior to the time of implantation. This is just very early. Also, notice the mother of my Lord, Kurios, using that Christological title to refer to
Hmm.
Jesus, who again is just weeks in utero. And then I think another detail of the text would be that Elizabeth's choice of words, she uses the word brephos, baby, the Greek word. That's the same word that you will find in Luke chapter 2:16
Hmm.
to refer to the baby lying in the manger. So again, I think that Luke 1, and by the way, I'll say this, Cole. Luke tells us that both Elizabeth and her unborn child John are filled with the Holy Spirit in this episode, which I think
Hmm.
that tells us their reaction is both fitting and appropriate.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's one of many texts that you list in here. Reading through this, some of them they stick out to you. Psalm 139, I think, is one that people go to. Luke 1 is one that you start to see the implications when you read it. But then there were several I'd never even thought about in here, and it added something to the way I see the Bible speaking to this issue. And so, just for that chapter and the historical chapter alone, there's a short biblical theology of kind of the pro-life position that's really, really helpful. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, okay, we've got the biblical case, we've got the Dobbs decision, we've got kind of the history of abortion in America. I learned stuff through every chapter, but I sat up in my chair the first time you mentioned that you were going to take the incrementalist position because this is something I've thought a lot about, and it's something that you see that's an intramural dispute among Christians. In fact, you include an appendix on this. Your third appendix is an incrementalist response to abortion abolitionists. So let me tee you up here. The abortion abolitionist is somebody who says, okay, if this is murder, if it's a person, life begins at conception, it's a person, abortion is murder, then we should do everything in our power. We should settle for no compromises. We should treat this with the utmost seriousness and get rid of abortion, and we can't settle for anything less. We've got to prosecute people. We've got to do, kind of an all or nothing approach. We need bills that make sure you can't have an abortion for any reason at any time. That stance, you can see why people take it. You can see, the seriousness, but maybe that's not the best way for Christians to respond. So, against that backdrop, what is the incrementalist position and why are you in favor of it?
Yeah. And Cole, this is, like you said, an intramural debate. I think you very charitably framed the different positions. I think what I would say is the reason I think Doug Wilson has coined the phrase "smash mouth incrementalist." I would want to put that as a descriptor for my position as well. Actually,
Yeah.
um, I frankly put it this way: I want to save as many babies as I can on the way to fully abolishing abortion. I think
Hmm.
my abolitionist friends have a morally and theologically consistent position, and we share the same goal. We share the same end. What I will say though, if I can put it almost kind of in a punchy way, I live in a world where Democrats and pro-abortion folks exist. And, again, I live here in Washington, D.C. Earlier this year, the new Republican majorities in the House and Senate, they took up legislation, as I mentioned earlier, to uh, provide legal protection for babies who survive a botched abortion. Again, you can look this up, called the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act. I would argue that's not even a pro-life bill. This is saying we're against infanticide,
Hmm.
and you could not find a single United States senator who's a member of the Democratic Party to vote for that. And I think maybe it was just one member of the House of Representatives. And so, frankly, again, I want to save all babies, but we live in a political situation where that is not feasible in every single jurisdiction. And so, I want to be aggressively pro life. And I think that looks different in different jurisdictions. I think you can be more aggressively pro life in Oklahoma than you can in California.
Hmm.
California, they're literally paying for people to come to California to get abortion. Uh, in California, a pro-life win is simply saying that you can't be forced to advertise abortion in your crisis pregnancy center. And even
Right.
that, the California legislature tried to force pregnancy centers to advertise for abortion, which is insane. That case
Hmm.
went all the way to the Supreme Court. And so, I regret where we are in our culture. 49 years of the morally corrosive effects of Roe v. Wade has made this country more pro-abortion than we would have ever imagined or like to had admit, like to admit. And so, again, I am someone who wants to save as many babies as I can. If I could pass a heartbeat bill, I'd be thrilled. I'd praise God, and then I'd wake up the next morning and try to go for more.
Hmm.
But if the house is burning and I can only save one out of a couple people that are there, I'm going to say do as much good as I possibly can and wake up the next morning and fight for more. And again, I don't think that's morally inconsistent. What I will say with my abolitionist friends who actively will vote against pro-life bills, they will side with the Democrats in a various state legislature. In my view, I think that does more harm than good. Again, we want to be morally consistent in our ethic, um, but we also have to be realist. And
Hmm.
politics is the art of the possible. And so, again, I'm just someone who wants to do as much good as I can with the cards that I'm dealt in a given hand.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with your position. I think I think it is wise for Christians to think about, yes, if our ultimate goal is this, how can we get there? How can we actually make it happen? And there's some stats that you have in your book when you go through the way different states, this is played out. Like I thought North Carolina was especially interesting. There's been a lot of work to try to get something and then work on the next step and then work on the next step to try to save some. And in one of those, you talk about, there's a bill that passes. It's, a ban after a certain amount of time. A lot of Christians wanted it to be more extensive than that, but it's already saved almost 100,000 babies. And so, you look at that and you say, would you be willing to give up those 100,000 to be a little bit more, ideologically pure? No, actually, I'd much rather save them. And then, like you said, wake up the next day and continue to work for more. I think it's wise. I think what you outline here is really helpful, because sometimes Christians are feeling like they're stuck in the middle. You have the discipleship of the left, you have the kind of popular understanding, but then you also have this kind of hard line and say, if we can't do everything we want to do, should we do anything? This is a really practical approach that you lay out in the book. I could ask you questions about the book forever, but I want people to read it. We're going to give it away on our Instagram, so people be looking on our Instagram this week for a giveaway. I guess the last thing I'd ask you is if you could make a few predictions about the future. I mean, this was kind of the holy grail, and now it's been achieved. And I think there's a regrouping, regathering kind of feel. If you could make a few predictions about the future of the pro-life movement, what's next, what trends are you seeing, and then encouragements, what would those be?
Yeah. The biggest trend that I'm seeing is the rise in chemical abortion. So
Hmm.
this is not new in the sense that it was under the Clinton administration in the year 2000 that you have abortion through these two pills. The first pill basically starves the baby, prevents the progesterone from nourishing the baby, and then the second pill forces contractions, and then the fetal matter is expelled. And initially, Cole, there were safeguards. Again, this is never safe for the baby, but there was certain safeguards for the woman. You could only use it through 49 days gestation. You had to do 3 in-person doctor visits. It had to actually be a doctor, believe it or not, that was prescribing these pills. First under the Obama administration and then under the Biden administration, most of those safeguards were walked back. Now you can request these pills online. You never have to be seen by a doctor. It doesn't even have to be a doctor that dispenses these. And so now it's about 63% of abortions actually take place through these chemical abortions. I'm 35 years old. I think my generation, certainly older folks than me, when they think about abortion, they probably think of an abortion clinic, a physical surgical clinic. We need to realize that with the rise of these pills, every college dorm room is a possible abortion clinic now.
Hmm.
And so grateful that Bobby Kennedy at HHS has ordered the FDA to review the approval process for the chemical abortion pills. That this is the next frontier, and we don't know what's going to come from this. We need to be praying, in my view, that HHS and the FDA realizes these are dangerous to women. There was a recent study just this year that came out that showed that over 10.93% of women who take these pills end up having an adverse health reaction,
Yeah.
whether it's hemorrhaging, sepsis. This is the next frontier. These
Hmm.
pills. Um, right now, a lot of blue states, think California, New York, have passed shield laws that allow these pills to be mailed across state lines into states that maybe have banned abortion. And so, again, you might live in Oklahoma or Louisiana where you say, we have awesome pro life laws. You do, but that doesn't at all protect women in that state from ordering these pills online or having those pills ordered by someone else. Again, there's no doctor visit. So again, it could be a pimp, it could be an abusive boyfriend that is ordering. This has happened in Louisiana. There was a woman, a teenage girl, whose mother ordered these pills and forced her to take them, and she had a horrible medical reaction. So Cole, again, that's the bad part. That's what's coming. As far as encouragement, let me speak to the church, specifically the pastors. That one statistic that we found that 71%, 3 out of 4 of folks in churches want more training, specifically worldview training on abortion and the value of human life. What an opportunity. I'm not someone who thinks the pastor should get up and do politics in the pulpit. I believe in expositional preaching, verse by verse. Tell me what God's word says. Main point of your sermon should be the main point of the text. But there are so many passages that have pro-life implications, and there's a hunger. Everyone in our culture, especially when you come to an election season, talks about these issues, whether it's sexual ethics. That should be another issue of this podcast where we come back and talk about transgenderism and all that's
Hmm.
happening there. But the Bible has a clear word. There's a "Thus saith the Lord." There's a chapter and verse. We don't have to guess what God's opinion is on these issues, and God's people want to know. I think that's the most encouraging thing to me, Cole. And so again, if I was a preacher, pastor, someone with discipleship responsibilities, you can find that research, by the way, at frc.org/worldview. You can download all of our research, and you can use that even in your preaching and teaching ministries. That would be an encouragement I would have for those with ministry leadership opportunities.
Well, David, I can't praise this book enough. This is Life After Roe. I've got it here. I can see it over your shoulder as well. David Closson, great book. We'll be giving it away this week. I think it's something that anybody who's thinking about this topic should have. It's a great manual. You do a great job of putting the research and the statistics in a form that's easy to remember, easy to understand. You don't get bogged down with what I know. You guys went through a tremendous amount of data, and then the history is so helpful too, the history in the church and in our country. This is just a great resource. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for joining us on the So We Speak podcast.
Well, thank you again for having me. Really appreciate it, Cole. God bless.